Over the years here at Nomad Capitalist, I've seen too many U.S. citizens and green card holders who went overseas to live, do business, or invest face potential penalties of a very high order because they didn't follow simple strategies to make sure they stayed on the good side of the IRS. Today, I'm going to share with you a couple of those stories and tell you what you need to do to make sure you don't get into trouble. Hey guys, I'm Andrew Henderson. I'm the author of the book Nomad Capitalist, and we help 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs legally reduce their taxes overseas, build their freedom with second passports, invest in emerging markets. You can learn more at nomadcapitalist.com. Now, obviously, we're not going to share people's specific stories, but I wanted to give you some basic ideas of things that we've run into over the years because, quite honestly, some of the things that I've seen people get themselves into did not have to happen. Now, let's start with the basics. If you're a U.S. citizen, if you're a U.S. green card holder, if you are any type of what's called U.S. person, as defined by the IRS, could mean you simply spent too much time living in the United States and visiting 1 year, and you didn't have the proper tax residence somewhere else. If you are in that category, you are required to file income tax returns no matter where you live in the world. This is a very unique thing for U.S. citizens. It's really the only country in the developed world that requires this, but they do. Now, as we often talk about, does that mean that you cannot legally reduce your taxes by going overseas and moving your business overseas? No, it does not. You can do that. You can reduce your taxes dramatically, but you still have to phone home, as it were. You still have to tell the IRS, here's what I'm doing. You've got to file all the forms explaining your offshore businesses, and you might have to pay something. So let's go through some scenarios. Not so long ago, I met with a gentleman who, for about 10 years, had been living in Europe. He'd been paying taxes in Europe. He wasn't exactly paying zero. And he had a U.S. accountant that he'd always used from the time he lived in the United States in his small town in the U.S., who was dutifully filing an income tax return for him. He didn't owe anything because he was paying more in Europe. But what did the accountant not do? The accountant did not file FBARs for him. This is where you report your foreign bank accounts. And I guess the argument was, well, you're living in a country and your bank accounts in that country, so it's not really foreign. Well, that's not true. If you have bank accounts in Europe, it doesn't matter if you're living there. It doesn't matter if you're using them just to pay your household bills or, in his case, his mortgage. It's a foreign bank account, as in not in the United States. You have to file an FBAR. And we went through and figured out that at one point the balance in these accounts was almost $1 million US. The IRS can, in theory, come in, the Treasury can come in, they can theoretically take up to half of the high balance of an account that's not reported. These accounts had not been reported for years. And so got him over to one of our tax professionals, got him hooked up with them, going through and basically in the process of saying, hey, I made a mistake, wasn't aware of this, I was working with this other person, I just found out, let me get compliant, let me go through a streamlined process to report these accounts and get back on track. Okay? Had another case a while ago where someone had been living again in Europe and again paying taxes. They were not following my pay as little as you can plan. They were living in Europe and they had a company there. And once again, their U.S. accountant had said, well, we don't really need to file any forms for that company because you're living there. I think pretty much the same argument. Also not true. If you have a foreign corporation and you're a U.S. person, you have to file Form 5471, for example. Hadn't filed those for years. Penalties $10,000 a year. We had to go back and again hook them up with the appropriate tax professional who has the letters and licenses after their name and have them go and fix that. Okay. And so I've seen numerous situations like this where I didn't know I had to report my foreign bank accounts, sometimes because I lived there, other times because I don't know why, I just was told I didn't have to. I've also seen I did not know I had to report my foreign corporations. I set up an offshore company, or in the case of some of these folks, like the one I just mentioned, it wasn't really an offshore company, it was offshore to the US, but it was in a country where they lived. It was not set up for the purpose of paying less tax. It was just, hey, that's where my business is. I moved over here, and now I've got a company over here. Those are two of the big ones. And so there are not only informational returns for for US citizens who, for example, have US companies like LLCs. Those may need to have informational returns. If you have a foreign corporation, you're going to need to file a return for that, and you have to go through and say, here are the numbers. Okay. If you have bank accounts overseas and the balances of those exceed $10,000, meet or exceed $10,000 in the aggregate at any point during the year, you have to report those bank accounts or other foreign financial accounts. Now, the two exceptions we've talked about here before are foreign real estate and privately vaulted precious metals outside of the financial system overseas. Pretty much everything else is going to be reportable in some way, shape, or form. The penalties for these, $10,000 a form per year, $25,000 a form per year, up to half the money in the account. And the mistakes that I see people making are sometimes so common. I had another couple come to me, and I've seen this numerous times, where someone convinced them to set up a company offshore, continue living in the United States, and not paying taxes. There's things like controlled foreign corporation rules. There's all kinds of different permanent establishment. I mean, every country has minded management, all kinds of rules that can make your offshore company taxed where you live. That's why it's important to follow my tax-friendly quadrant and make sure that you and your company are in a tax-friendly environment, right? But I've seen repeatedly folks who have gotten bad tax advice about just moving their assets somewhere else. You can get asset protection keeping assets overseas if you live in the United States, but you're not going to get a tax benefit if you're living in the United States 365 days a year and you own the company. So these are some of the most common mistakes that I make, namely with folks who are already overseas. Now, what is the key uniting element between all these situations? So they had a U.S. accountant who focused on domestic tax, sometimes was a small town accountant, usually was someone they had used for years before they decided to get into the offshore world or before they decided to leave. And these accountants are in over their head. I know, probably 9 or 10 good guys who are in the offshore world. I probably know most of the people who are really talented in the offshore world, who aren't in the big four, charge you $100,000, give you a report that you don't even understand kind of thing. Just on the everyday entrepreneur, small business level, there aren't that many people in this game who really know what they're doing. And it's funny, when we talk, we'll always kind of complain. They'll really, more than I, complain about how these guys in the US, they don't know what they're talking about, so they just say don't do it. Or they go the other direction where it's just like, well, I don't know why you should file a form for that. And you get stuck on one side or the other. I've had so many people who have come to me and they've said, I talked to my accountant in Sheboygan who said, no, you can't go offshore. There's nothing you can do. You absolutely can go offshore. You can reduce your taxes dramatically to 0, 4, 10, any percent, whatever it is that you may want. There's a proper way to do it. On the other side of the coin, you don't just want to throw caution to the wind and not report things that you're required to report to the IRS. By the way, if you live in the United States, you're allowed to have a bank account in another country, but you also need to report that, right? And so it's not even an issue necessarily of being offshore, but simply having offshore investments. If you have a rental property overseas, the property itself may not be disclosable, but the income from it certainly is. And then it's a matter of, is there a tax treaty? Is there a credit? There's a lot to factor in. And so that common element of most tax people who are in any domestic situation know none of that. I've seen in my own life very high-level tax firms really miss the mark on some of the most simple stuff. I mean, the most simple stuff. So here's what I tell people. Number one, you want to have a strategy. When you just wander into something, that's when you get into trouble. And that's the way a lot of people get into this offshore stuff, right? They just kind of wander into it. They hear me talking about investing in Colombia, they kind of wander in, they buy a property, then they kind of trying to figure out what happens next. It's always important to have a plan. I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, and that's the order, and I have to file this form in this country and that form in that country. And you want to have a strategy first. What is it going to look like, right? It's like you go out and you get a table from IKEA, and they give you a manual. Here's how to build the table. It doesn't get you halfway through how to build the table. It gets you all the way through how to build the table. You want to have that whole manual in front of you of what's going to happen before you go. And once you have that, and once you put that strategy that you've intentionally laid out in place, and you know what the requirements are for each part of it. Hey, I'm going to form a company. in Colombia to own my Colombian property. The requirement in the US is I have to file this form, and then to move the money, it's this form, and then in Colombia I'm doing this. Once you lay that all out, then you get the Colombian guy to file the form there. You get the US international focused preparer to do that. There are a lot of preparers in the international world who are perfectly fine, but they cater to folks who are, living overseas. They make, $90,000 salary, that kind of thing. And it's just pretty basic form filling. They'll do your FBARs, for example. But if you're doing more advanced entrepreneurial stuff, if you're doing more advanced investment stuff beyond just I earn a salary and I've got a bank account to pay my rent in Switzerland, right? You probably want a higher level expat tax professional. Again, whether you personally are living overseas or whether the money is just overseas, doesn't matter. That's the kind of person that you want. So strategy plus specialist. Okay, those are the two things that you want. Don't just go, God bless Nancy, who's been doing your taxes in Dubuque, Iowa since 1972. Nancy ain't knowing nothing about any FBARs, okay? We don't want Nancy anymore. Keep Nancy for whatever else you want, but we need someone who specializes in this because Nancy's going to get you into a problem and you're going to lose $100,000 of your money. That's the common element. It's always the domestic preparer. It's always a lack of strategy. People just do stuff. Listen, I'm a lifelong entrepreneur. I just go out and do stuff. I love doing stuff. But when it comes to things involving the IRS, you want to know where you're going with it. Those are my 2 tips for getting in trouble with the IRS when you go offshore. How can Nomad Capitalist help you? 4 ways. Number 1, subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell to make sure you get our new video every day. Number 2, get a copy of Nomad Capitalist, the book. You'll learn a lot of my personal experiences over a dozen years of studying this stuff, as well as exactly some of the strategies that you can use to build your Nomad Capitalist plan. Number 3, if you're not sure where to start, but you want to come and learn from my team and I, you want to come and mingle with like-minded people, learn more about our live conference, Nomad Capitalist Live. It's coming up soon. And number 4, if you want some help right now because you've got a burning issue, you need something solved, you want to lower your taxes, get a second passport, or build the Nomad Capitalist lifestyle of your dreams, go to nomadcapitalist.com and click on Become a Client.